It was a quiet Tuesday evening on December 3rd, 1957, in Sycamore, Illinois. Best friends 7-year-old Maria and 8-year-old Kathy enjoyed themselves while playing in the first snowfall of winter. They remained blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked nearby. As they giggled and played a game of Duck the Cars, the young man made his way toward them, charming his way into their little group. In the next few moments, both their lives and those of their families would be forever changed. But who was the stranger? And what were his intentions?
She took a piggyback ride from him, got on his back. I came out without mittens on, so my hands were cold, and I went home to get mittens. When I came back, Johnny and Maria were nowhere to be seen.
Police were out with spotlights and a megaphone.
The police all started showing up, asking the same questions over and over and over.
Hello and welcome back to M7 Crime Storytime. Today we take a look at one of the twisted case of Maria Ridulph. Sycamore, Illinois has been home to the annual Sycamore Pumpkin Festival since 1962, after resident Wally Thoreau began displaying pumpkins on his front lawn. Named after the sycamore tree, the city is considered a good place to live and raise a family due to its affordability. It's a green city and has many wide-open spaces and parks. And, like other cities, Sycamore too has its share of crime, but has seen a decline in the last decade. The Sycamore of 1957, though, was a far cry from what we see now. Back then, the worst crimes were obscene graffiti drawn on sidewalks, until a crime that shook all Americans occurred. And that is the story we take a closer look at today: the disappearance and murder of Maria Ridulph. Maria Elizabeth Ridulph was born on March 2, 1950, to parents Michael and Frances Ridulph. She was the youngest of 4 children with 2 older sisters, Kay and Pat, and an older brother named Chuck. She lived in Sycamore, Illinois with her family. Her father worked at a factory while her mother was a homemaker. Being the youngest, Maria was doted upon by her family. Her easy smile, brown eyes, and tinkling laughter made people gravitate towards her naturally. She was also a rather nervous child who her mother described as high-strung and prone to hysterics if she found herself in trouble. Maria was a diligent young girl and attended Sunday school every week. In 1957, Maria was in the 2nd grade at West Elementary School in Sycamore. The 7-year-old was a well-behaved child who achieved good grades and made many friends. Her teachers described her as having big, expressive brown eyes and loud, cheerful laughter. Her best friend was her neighbor, 8-year-old Kathy Sigmund. Both girls were very close. They walked to and from school daily and often spent time together over at each other's houses. It was the first snowfall of the season, and both girls were looking forward to the coming holidays. On December 3rd, 1957, both Maria and Kathy spent their afternoon making paper snowflakes at Maria's house. At around 5 p.m., Kathy left to go home for dinner with her family. Maria and her family too sat down and prepared to have a meal. Maria, though, was not really hungry, so after eating just enough, she begged her parents to let her go outside. In 1957, the neighborhood in which Maria lived was considered very safe. People didn't lock their doors, and robberies were not common. Although it was dark, Maria's parents allowed her to go outside. She then called Kathy's home to ask if she could also come out and play in the snow. Both girls met near a large tree on the corner of Center Cross Street and Archie Place. They decided to play a game called Duck the Cars, in which they hid behind a tree every time they saw headlights approaching. It was while playing this game that a young man caught their attention. He approached them and introduced himself as Johnny. He told both girls he was 24 years old and unmarried. He then asked them if they enjoyed piggyback rides and dolls. Maria and Kathy responded with a yes, and he offered them both a piggyback ride, which Kathy declined. After a while, Maria ran back home to fetch one of her dolls while Kathy waited outside with Johnny. When she'd got her doll, Johnny gave Maria a piggyback ride. Growing cold, Kathy said that she wanted to go home to fetch some mittens and asked Maria to come along with her. Maria said she wanted to stay with Johnny, and so Kathy returned to her house before going back out to play with Maria on the road. However, when she came back to the spot, both Maria and Johnny had disappeared.
She took a piggyback ride from him, got on his back. I came out without mittens on, so my hands were cold, and I went home to get mittens. When I came back, Johnny and Maria were nowhere to be seen.
At first, Kathy tried calling out for Maria, but got no response. Unsure of what to do, Kathy went to the Ridulph house and told Maria's parents what had happened. Maria's brother Chuck left home to look for her around the neighborhood and was accompanied by his friend Randy, who had been over at the Ridulph's house. Both boys called out for Maria, but could not find her anywhere. In the meanwhile, Michael escorted Kathy back home. Once home, Kathy told her mother, Flora, about what happened, and the man they met called Johnny. Flora called Frances and told her to contact the police, but Michael was hesitant. This was because Maria had gone missing a year earlier and was later discovered to be playing in a cemetery as she'd wandered off absent-mindedly and lost track of time. Maria eventually returned home after the incident before a search could be organized. Michael didn't want to create another panic. Maria's mother, Frances, though, did not have the same belief as her husband, and instead drove to the police station to report Maria missing. At first, Chuck too was not as invested in finding Maria, as he believed she would eventually turn up at the house when she grew tired and scared. That was until he found the doll Maria had taken from home lying on the side of a neighbor's garage. He knew Maria loved her dolls and wouldn't return home without them. He grabbed the doll and returned home to tell his father. The discovery put Maria's family on edge, and within an hour, a search party of police officers and armed civilians set out to look for Maria. They knocked on neighbors' doors and searched through alleyways and parks, calling out for Maria. Hundreds of volunteers came out to search for Maria and the man they called Johnny. The women joined in by helping make coffee and sandwiches to distribute to those conducting the search. After hours of searching, they could not locate either Maria or Johnny. But no one had given up just yet. As the search continued, police questioned Kathy about what happened that evening before Maria disappeared. Kathy repeated her experience to police about how Maria disappeared. She was able to give the police a description. Kathy described Johnny as being light-haired, being in his early 20s, a gap between his front teeth, tall with a slender chin, and wearing a brightly colored sweater with green, blue, and yellow stripes. The next day, local newspaper headlines covered the mysterious disappearance of Maria and Johnny. Articles provided a description of both Maria and her alleged kidnapper. Maria's parents turned to the media in order to get the attention of the kidnapper. They pleaded with the kidnapper to return their daughter. Through interviews, Maria's mother, Frances, urged her to stay calm and promised they would be together again soon. Police continued the physical search, checking car trunks and cellars for any sign of Maria. Every house in the town was searched, but there was nothing. After 2 days, the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the search as well, with fear growing that Maria may have been taken across state lines. The story became a national sensation, and in time, both J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, and the United States President, Dwight Eisenhower, took a personal interest in the case, requesting regular updates about the progress. No resources were spared in the search for Maria, as aircraft flew over the town searching for the little girl and her kidnapper. They even went as far as to drain a lake and set off explosives at a local quarry in hopes of finding traces of Maria, but there was nothing. Police started to believe that whomever killed Maria was not a local, but rather someone from out of town. They waited to hear from the kidnapper, but no ransom demand or communication ever came through, and they began to fear the worst. A week after Maria's disappearance, investigators began telling search groups to keep an eye out for large flocks of carrion birds who might be feasting on a possible decomposing body. Being the only witness, Kathy was placed in protective custody, and investigators continued to show her pictures of possible suspects. She could never truly find a picture that matched with Johnny, and after multiple photo lineups, she started to grow confused. Eventually, Kathy picked out a picture of a 35-year-old man named Thomas Joseph Rivard. For investigators in the family, it was a relief. They were certain that they'd finally found their suspect. Rivard, however, had a solid alibi. He was in prison at the time of the kidnapping. He was also much older than the man named Johnny, who had identified himself as being 24 years old when he met both girls. It had been disappointing, as their only eyewitness had been wrong after all. Kathy remained in protective custody, as investigators believed that Johnny might return to silence her. It was during this time that investigators came across another lead. Their hopes were reignited when police received another promising lead. Someone had finally given them a name of another possible suspect. On December 6, 1957, a woman phoned the police claiming that her neighbor, who was a young man named Trashner, fit the killer's description. Records, however, didn't show anyone by the name of Trashner living in the area, but there was a family who went by the surname Tessier. On December 8, 1957, FBI agents visited the Tessier residence. Both Ralph and Eileen Tessier agreed that their eldest son John fit the description of the suspect, but he'd been in Rockford, 40 miles away at the time of the kidnapping. This was confirmed by phone records that proved that Tessiers did receive a call at around 7 p.m. that evening, and the operator at the time recorded the caller as being John Tessier. According to them, John had called from Rockford requesting a ride from his stepfather, Ralph. John was taken in for questioning by investigators. He explained that on December 2nd and 3rd, 1957, he'd been in Chicago undergoing physical examinations because he wanted to enlist in the U.S. military. On the morning of December 3rd, 1957, he visited the Chicago Recruiting Center, and records corroborated his statement. He then spent the day sightseeing in Chicago before returning to Rockford by train that same evening. According to John, he arrived in Rockford around 6:45 p.m. and called his parents for a ride home. He then visited the Rockford recruiting station to drop off paperwork. This was once again corroborated with officials who made note of meeting with John after 7 p.m. that evening. However, they noted that John seemed out of sorts and agitated, as if he'd been coming down from a drug trip. The next step investigators took was to conduct a lie detector test at the police station. Given that John seemed to tick all the boxes in their investigation, his authenticity needed to be verified. John passed the lie detector test. Given his positive result and the alibi, the FBI struck John off the suspect list. On December 11, 1957, John left Sycamore and enlisted in the Lackland Air Force Base to begin his basic training. The investigators' one lead had seemingly proven false, and the search for Maria continued well through the festive season and into spring. The Ridulph family remained in a state of limbo. They were uncertain of whether to hold on to hope that Maria and her abductor would be found. On April 26, 1958, the case took a tragic turn. A couple foraging for mushrooms near Woodbine, Illinois, came across skeletal remains near a fallen tree. Initially, they believed it to be that of a small animal or dog. On closer inspection, they saw that it was the remains of a small child. The body was still clothed in a shirt, undershirt, and white socks. They called authorities immediately from the nearest farmhouse. When police arrived, they took note of the state of decomposition and deduced that the body had been left there for months. James Furlong, who was the coroner at the time, instructed crime scene technicians to take general location pictures and not any of the child, as he did not want these images to somehow be leaked to the press. Investigators already suspected who the body might belong to, and after conducting an examination, Maria Ridulph was positively identified through her dental records, the shirt that she'd been wearing, and a lock of hair. She'd been discovered 5 months later and over 100 miles away from her home in Sycamore. The rest of Maria's clothing was never found. An autopsy could not properly identify a cause of death. However, it was ruled as a homicide. Given that Maria was found within the state of Illinois, the FBI withdrew from the case and left the investigation solely to state and local police. Maria Ridulph was laid to rest later that week at the Elmwood Cemetery in Sycamore. Her funeral was attended by over 300 people. Her family and friends were left devastated by the tragedy. She'd been a bright light snuffed out by a monster. With their hearts heavy, they prayed justice would prevail. She was remembered as an intelligent and fun-loving girl by those who gave tributes at her funeral. The hymn, "Jesus Loves Me," was played during the service as it was Maria's favorite. After the funeral, Kathy remained in protective custody. Her life had changed irrevocably. People called her the girl who was last seen with Maria. It became difficult for Kathy to make new friends as many were scared. The lives of everyone were forever changed by the tragedy of Maria Ridulph's murder. The large tree that Maria and Kathy had played under that fateful evening was cut down a year after Maria went missing. Investigators continued to pursue the case, but it would eventually grow cold. With no new leads and their closest possible suspect eliminated, there was nothing more that could be done. It remained open as a cold case, but other newer cases took priority, and soon Maria's murder became a haunting memory for those left behind in the aftermath of the tragedy. It was a disappointment for the Ridulph family. The hope they flourished briefly in their hearts was extinguished by another false lead. The case had hit a brick wall and remained frozen for decades. Another 40 years would pass before a new lead emerged in the case. After 4 decades, a case that haunted not only the Ridulph family, but Sycamore as a whole had a suspect. In 1997, Sycamore Police Lieutenant Patrick Solar put through the name of another suspect. He suggested that William Henry Redmond, a former truck driver and carnival worker, had been responsible for the death of Maria Ridulph. Redmond, however, had passed away in 1992, but Solar believed that Redmond fit the profile due to his criminal history. According to Solar, Redmond had told fellow inmates that he committed a crime similar to the abduction of Maria Ridulph. Solar also believed that Redmond's appearance and behavior matched the suspect known as Johnny. Solar's investigation and subsequent report was criticized due to the lack of supporting evidence, and he himself agreed that it was merely circumstantial. The case was thereafter labeled as closed but not solved, which left the possibility that a better suspect may one day be found. Although decades had passed, Kathy never forgot the nightmare. She suffered from a syndrome known as survivor's guilt, said psychologists. When she grew up, she eventually moved away from Sycamore after meeting a man named Mark Chapman in the early 70s. After marriage, Kathy and Mark moved to Texas, then Florida. They raised their 3 children there. But the memory never quite left Kathy, and she always thought about that evening and if Johnny was still out there waiting for her. Kathy and her family eventually moved back to Illinois. By the mid-2000s, many referred to Maria's disappearance and death as Sycamore's 9/11, as it had changed the face of the town forever. Decades passed before investigators were alerted to a scintillating clue, a newly discovered lead that was about to heat up the ice-cold case. In 2008, 51 years after the disappearance and murder of Maria Ridulph, investigators were presented with new information. The case was about to take an unexpected turn. Things that had been buried along with Maria back in 1958 began to resurface. Janet Tessier, the half-sister of John Tessier, had sent an email to the Sycamore police tip line. The email implicated her half-brother John as being responsible for the abduction and murder of 7-year-old Maria Ridulph. In the email, she explained that her mother Eileen had made a confession on her deathbed.
She grabbed my wrist in the strongest grip. She said those 2 little girls and the one disappeared. John did it, and you have to tell someone.
And Janet did just that. After her mother had passed away on January 23, 1994, she'd made numerous calls to the Sycamore Police Department, who told her to leave the case alone. She then contacted the FBI, who referred her to the Sycamore Police to deal with the case. For the next 14 years, Janet tried reaching out on several occasions, and she finally got the attention of detectives Larry Cott and Brian Hanley, who decided to reopen the case. In her email, she explained the events of that fateful December night. In her email, Janet told the detectives that John had changed his name to Jack Daniel McCullough in honor of their late mother. Detectives began looking into the claims made by Janet and discovered that John did indeed change his name to Jack Daniel McCullough in 1994. It was now time for them to start their own investigation into who Jack McCullough really was. Jack McCullough was born John Cherry on November 27, 1939, in Belfast, Northern Ireland. His father was a British sergeant named Samuel Cherry, who married his mother Eileen just before the Second World War. His father was killed early in the war, and his mother Eileen went on to become one of the first female airplane spotters with the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force. It was during this time she met Ralph Tessier, who was serving with the United States 8th Army Air Force. John had lived away from London during the height of the war with his grandparents. In November 1944, Ralph and Eileen married and relocated with John when he was 7 years old to Sycamore, Illinois. They had 6 more children, and John took the name of Tessier, but sometimes called himself John Cherry. The Tessier family lived about 2 blocks from the Ridulph home in Sycamore. John, according to his siblings, was his mother's favorite, and she often covered for him when he got into trouble. He was expelled from school in the 10th grade after pushing a teacher and calling her an obscene name. His mother allegedly overlooked the incident. At the time of Maria's disappearance, John was 18 years old and still living with his parents while he'd been making plans to enlist with the U.S. Air Force. This had all been covered in the previous interviews conducted by investigators back in 1957, and John had been cleared as a suspect by the FBI and Sycamore Police Department. The new claims had prompted the new detectives into digging a bit deeper into John Tessier's past. Detectives spoke to John's half-sisters, Catherine and Janine Tessier, who claimed that they heard their mother speaking to police the night Maria disappeared. They alleged Eileen had lied to police about John being home that night. But the most explosive confessions were yet to unfold. John allegedly harassed Janine while he lived with the family. John also developed a bad reputation in the neighborhood. A witness named Pamela Long came forward, claiming her father had once had to intervene when John refused to put her down after giving her a piggyback ride.
I was about 8 years old, and so we were playing on the screened-in porch. He said, "Would you like to go for a piggyback ride with Johnny?" And I said, yes. We went all the way up the street, a block, turned left, went down a block, and my dad came rushing over, jerked me off Johnny's shoulders, told him to never go near his daughter again, or so help me. My dad thought he was very strange and scared him.
Soon after John had left to join the Air Force, his family had become estranged from him. He told them not to attend their mother's funeral. John had spent 13 years in the U.S. military, retiring as a captain. He left the service and moved to Seattle, Washington, where he attended and graduated from the police academy in June 1974. John then joined the Lacey Police Department before transferring to the Milton Police Department in Washington. Here he clashed with the police chief, who had proof of his constant misconduct. Several women claimed that John had harassed them, but the final nail in his coffin came from the testimony of Michelle Weinman, who had been 15 years old in 1982. Weinman was a known runaway who had known John as a Milton police officer. John offered her accommodation. Weinman alleged that John had been inappropriate with her, and she formally charged John with abuse. John was charged with a felony initially, but after plea negotiations, the charge was dropped to a misdemeanor, and he pled guilty to communication with a minor for immoral purposes. He was sentenced to 1 year of formal probation and was officially terminated from the Milton Police Department on March 10, 1982. Thereafter, John formally changed his name to Jack McCullough on April 27, 1994. He then became an amateur photographer until 2001. The only piece of evidence holding John's alibi in place was the phone call made from Rockford on the night of December 3, 1957. But this evidence was about to fall apart after investigators made contact with a former girlfriend of John. During the initial investigation, police were never able to provide their witness, Kathy Sigmund, with a photo of John Tessier. He dropped out of school, therefore there is no picture of him in the yearbook. However, in reopening the investigation, they made contact with his former girlfriend, Jen Swafford. She was able to provide investigators with a more contemporary picture of John. Unknowingly, Jen was about to give investigators evidence that was going to blow the entire case wide open. She handed police an unused military-issued train ticket from Rockford to Chicago. This led police to believe that John had used his own car to drive to Chicago from Rockford. He did claim to have spent the day of December 3, 1957, sightseeing in Chicago. It also led them to believe that John could possibly have driven to Sycamore that afternoon, kidnapped Maria, and returned to Rockford in the allotted time frame. Police went back to review the timeline. Several witnesses had claimed that they had not seen Maria or Kathy playing outside after 6:20 p.m. that evening. This included a bus driver who said that he'd not seen any girls outside when he took that specific turn at around 6:30 p.m. Another witness said he'd seen John's Pontiac in and around Sycamore the evening Maria disappeared. The witness added that he knew for a fact that John never allowed anyone else to drive his car. The statements from the recruiters placed John back in Rockford at around 7 p.m., and given the distance between the areas, it was possible he could have been in Sycamore that evening. Added to that, one of the recruiters he met on December 4, 1957, had noticed John had a cut lip. He alleged that John then commented that it was a good thing he'd not been in Sycamore the night before after the young girl had disappeared. This statement, along with the other witnesses at the time, had been included in the FBI's initial investigation. But now, the new team of investigators worked on the theory that the timeline from the original investigation was completely wrong. Working with the new timeline, investigators developed the theory that John had driven to Sycamore, kidnapped Maria at around 6:20 p.m., and returned to Rockford in order to make the call to his family. A testimony from John's half-sister Catherine backed up the theory that the timeline was warped, as she remembered the police search beginning at 7 p.m. that night. She claimed to have returned from a party and saw the search in progress, bringing the original timeline over an hour earlier than previously believed. They then turned to their only eyewitness, Kathy Sigmund Chapman. Kathy was shown several possible suspect photos, and this time it included the photo of John Tessier from his former girlfriend.
After Maria disappeared, my parents always said, "You are the only one that can recognize this man. You have to remember what he looks like till we find him."
She immediately identified John as the man she believed was Johnny from all those years ago. On June 29, 2011, 71-year-old John Tessier, who now went by the name Jack McCullough, was taken into custody by officers from the Seattle Police Department and interrogated. Given his background in law enforcement, he was interrogated by well-trained interviewers and vehemently denied having anything to do with the kidnapping and murder of Maria. He claimed that Maria was a well-loved child in their neighborhood.
And like you said, this is like 9/11, Kennedy. I mean, this was huge in Sycamore. Am I right?
I'm going to tell you something. I did not kidnap that little girl. I did. Look at my eyes. I did not have anything to do with that little girl.
Okay.
She was loved in the neighborhood. She was a little Mexican girl with big brown eyes, and she was sweet as could be, hardly said a word to anybody, and everyone loved her.
Okay.
This was crushing for the entire
for
city.
Community.
And
Absolutely.
it was crushing for me as well, because I knew the family.
Okay. All right.
When asked about his inappropriate behavior with his half-sister, he denied the allegation and claimed it was just two youngsters fooling around when they were younger. As more questions of Maria's disappearance came up, Jack became evasive and refused to answer anymore. He was arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridulph and extradited to Illinois. For the remaining members of the Ridulph family, justice for Maria had finally been served.
I have no sympathy for Jack being in prison, because I believe with all my heart that he is guilty.
It didn't matter that decades had passed. They now had a name, and their fight for answers was coming to a close. On July 27, 2011, Jack appeared in court the same day Maria's body was exhumed by investigators. A forensic anthropologist was able to determine that Maria had in fact been stabbed at least 3 times in the throat by marks found on her bones. Stabbing was therefore considered a likely cause of death, as the state of decomposition could not allow coroners from the original investigation to determine a definite cause. The arrest garnered nationwide interest, and pressure was put on Clay Campbell, who was at the time the DeKalb County State Attorney, by both the Ridulph and Tessier families. He was reluctant due to the age of the case and lack of physical evidence tying Jack to the murder, but eventually he agreed. Jack McCullough was formally charged with Maria Ridulph's abduction and murder, and the case went to trial in September 2012. Now aged 73, Jack McCullough went to trial. The prosecution argued that Jack was attracted to Maria given his clear memories of the girl that stemmed from obsession. They were never able to prove if Jack assaulted Maria before her death, but argued that new evidence suggested she was stabbed. Several witnesses took the stand, testifying to Jack's reputation and the numerous instances of misconduct he displayed in his youth and as a police officer in the years following. 3 inmates also gave their testimony, each of which differed from the other, particularly in the manner in which Maria was murdered. One testified she'd been strangled with a wire. Another said she'd been smothered to keep her from screaming. In the end, Kathy Sigmund Chapman took the stand and testified that Jack McCullough was indeed the man she remembered as Johnny. Jack's defense team argued that the case was only reopened due to pressure from both the Ridulph and Tessier families. They stated that there is no physical evidence, motive, or indication that Jack had been responsible for Maria's abduction and murder. Their defense hinged on the possibility of impaired memories and changing testimonies by witnesses.
An investigation attempted to do was use memories and emotion to change the timeline of the abduction.
After much deliberation, the jury presented their findings to the judge, and Jack McCullough was found guilty of the abduction and murder of Maria Ridulph on September 14, 2012. He was sentenced to life in prison with a possibility of parole in 20 years. But just as the Ridulph family breathed a sigh of relief that Maria's killer had been caught, the case took another twisted turn. Though most thought it was done, the case wasn't quite over. On February 13, 2015, Jack appealed his convictions. The Illinois Appellate Court vacated his kidnapping conviction due to the kidnapping of an infant being outside the 3-year statute of limitations, but upheld the murder charge. The court also found that the deathbed confession should not have been used as evidence, but found that the judge's decision did not rely on the statement when making his decision. In 2015, Jack once again filed a petition to have his murder conviction overturned. He was successful in filing a motion that allowed him to have a hearing with the state attorney's office. New state attorney Richard Schmack took over the case and reopened the case by conducting an extensive review of the evidence, including subpoenaed phone records from the night in question. At a court hearing in March 2016, Schmack argued that the phone records, the timelines of the original investigation, a failure to include the original evidence in the trial, and added to that the weather conditions on the night of December 3, 1957, could not have allowed for Jack to be in Sycamore at the time of Maria's disappearance. It was also found that before beginning the new polygraph test, Jack had requested that investigators stick to questions pertaining to the 1957 case. When the interviewer went off topic, Jack passed over the questions, refusing to answer. Jack's prosecution argued that in the interview, he was still asked questions not pertaining to the Maria Ridulph case. They believe the polygraph was used to create a prejudiced view that would paint Jack as a bad person. The judgment therefore found that Jack had been truthful about his involvement in the Maria Ridulph case in both the 1957 polygraph test and the second test conducted in 2011. All other information was irrelevant to the investigation. Following the March 2016 trial, Judge William Brady vacated Jack's murder conviction on April 15, 2016, and requested a new trial.
Sign an order vacating the judgment of conviction. These new factors may not have raised to the level of a reasonable probability of a different result. But collectively, when they are agreed to, by the state. In other words, the parties have agreed that these allegations of fact are true. This court does believe the defendant has met his burden under both the post-conviction petition and the 214-01 petition, and it will grant the request for a new trial.
Jack was released on bond that day. Judge Brady declared that should a new prosecutor wish to challenge the conviction, Jack could stand trial for murder once again. On August 5, 2016, Judge Brady denied the motion for a special prosecutor based on a petition brought forward by Charles Ridulph, Maria's brother. Charles therefore stated that he would not be appealing the ruling.
I didn't get the notice of this until this morning via email. I prayed for forgiveness because of my anger, and I prayed for the Lord to enable me to rejoice that Maria is above this.
On April 12, 2017, Jack McCullough was declared innocent of the crime by the DeKalb County Circuit Court. On July 21, 2016, Jack's son-in-law filed a lawsuit against the Sycamore Police Department and Illinois State Police for refusal to comply with the Freedom of Information Act. This was brought forward following Schmack's allegations of police misconduct during a request to retry the case on November 3, 2015. Jack's civil rights lawyer, who said that Illinois was the epicenter for wrongful convictions, and called for reform of the justice system. In July 2020, Jack received a settlement of $300,000 from the city of Seattle after a lawsuit was filed against the police department and detectives that investigated and arrested him. The case of Maria Ridulph remains closed and unsolved to this day, despite an anonymous letter received naming another suspect. The investigators have never released the name of the new suspect. This could be due to the need to properly verify the evidence after the tumultuous investigation led to the arrest of an innocent man in what can only be described as a modern-day witch hunt. But we'd like to hear your take on the case presented today and what your thoughts are on the investigation procedure and the reliability of the evidence. If you enjoyed the video, do like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more true crime content. Until next time, stay safe and thanks for watching.